Alright guys, this is going to be video 1 for Monday, March 30th. We're now getting into a new packet of reading. We're looking at review reading 3, creating a functioning government. So this is still the course, the APUSH course guidebooks, Unit 3, effects of a revolution, and then of course the articles and the creation of the Constitution. Basically everything up until John Adams' presidency ends in 1800. So that's where that unit ends for the APUSH guides and so forth. So anyway, we're going to pick up there with kind of the aftermath of the war, going straight into the Articles of Confederation first. Okay. The colonies did not want to wait to win their independence from England before setting up their own governments. As soon as the Declaration of Independence was signed, states began writing their own constitutions. In 1777, the Continental Congress sent the Articles of Confederation, the first national constitution, to the colonies for ratification. The colonists intentionally created little to no central government since they were afraid of ridding themselves of Britain's imperial rule, only to create their own tyrannical government. The articles contained several major limitations, as the country would soon learn. For one, it did not give the national government the power to tax or regulate trade. Furthermore, amendments to the articles required the unanimous consent of all the states, creating a situation in which one state could hold the others hostage to its demands. The Articles of Confederation were clearly more concerned with prohibiting the government from gaining too much power than about empowering it to function properly. With the end of the war, the colonies had other issues to confront as well. The decrease in England's power in the region opened a new era of relations with Native Americans. This era was even more contentious than the previous one, because a number of tribes had allied themselves with the crown. Second-class citizens, non-citizens, namely women and blacks, had made sacrifices in the fight for liberation, and some expected at least a degree of compensation. Abigail Adams wrote a famous letter to her husband pleading the case of women's rights in the new government. She reminded John to remember the ladies, to be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. The number of free blacks in the colonies grew during and after the war, but their increased presence among free whites was also accompanied by a growth of racist publications and legislation. Such conditions led to the early ghettoization of blacks, and for similar reasons, other minorities too. The problems with the Articles of Confederation became apparent early on. The wartime government, unable to levy taxes, tried to finance the war by printing more money, which led naturally to wild inflation. After the war, the British pursued punitive trade policies against the colonies, denying them access to the West Indian markets and dumping goods on American markets. The government, unable to impose tariffs, was helpless. A protective tariff would impose duties on imported goods. The additional cost would be added to the selling price, thereby raising the cost of foreign products by making domestic products cheaper than imports. Most tariffs protected American manufacturers. Having just fought a war in part because of taxes being imposed by a central authority, the newly independent Americans were reluctant to give power to their new federal government. In fact, the first protective tariff in the United States wasn't passed until 1816. The issue of the tariff exposed another source of tension with the new country: economic sectionalism, a major conflict that eventually led the nation to a civil war and continues to play a role in partisan politics even now. Furthermore, when state governments dragged their heels in compensating loyalists for lost property, the British refused to abandon military posts in the states, claiming that they were remaining to protect the loyalists' rights. The government, again, was powerless to expel them. Perhaps the ruthless awakening came in the form of Shays' Rebellion, lasting from August 1786 until January of 1787. It started with an army of 1,500 farmers from western Massachusetts marching on Springfield to protest a number of unfair policies, both economic and political. They were arrested and very angry, and they gave the elite class the wake-up call the revolution might not be over yet. As with the earlier Bacon's Rebellion and later Whiskey Rebellion, this rebellion revealed lingering resentment on the part of the backcountry farmers towards the coastal elite. One thing that especially worried the wealthy, though, was that the Articles of Confederation had created a national government that was essentially powerless to stop such rebellions. The government under the Articles was not totally without success, though. Its greatest achievement was the adoption of ordinances governing the sale of government land to settlers, best known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which also contained a Bill of Rights guaranteeing trial by jury, freedom of religion, and freedom from excessive punishment. It abolished slavery in the Northwest Territories, northwest of the Ohio River and east of Mississippi. It also set specific regulations concerning the conditions under which territories could apply for statehood. Thus, the ordinance is seen as a forerunner to the Bill of Rights and other progressive government policies. It was not so enlightened about Native Americans, however. In fact, it essentially claimed that their land without their consent. War ensued, and peace did not come until 1795, when the United States gained a military advantage over the Miami Confederacy, its chief Native American opponent in the area. The Northwest Ordinance remained important long after the Northwest Territories were settled because of its pertinence to the statehood process and to the issue of slavery. Okay, now a new constitution. By 1787, it was clear the federal government lacked sufficient authority under the Articles of Confederation. Alexander Hamilton was especially concerned that there was no uniform commercial policy and feared for the survival of the new republic. Hamilton convened what became to be known as the Annapolis Convention, but only 5 delegates showed up. Subsequently, Congress consented to a meeting in Philadelphia the following May for the sole purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. This meeting would eventually become the now famous Constitutional Convention, comprising delegates from all the states except Rhode Island, which met throughout the long, hot summer of 1787. Much has been written about the framers of the Constitution. There were 55 delegates, all men, all white, many of whom were wealthy lawyers or landowners, many of whom owned slaves. They came from many different ideological backgrounds, from those who felt the Articles needed only slight adjustments to those who wanted to tear them down and start from scratch. The New Jersey plan called for modifications and also called for equal representation from each state. The Virginia plan, largely a brainchild of James Madison, called for an entirely new government based on the principle of checks and balances, and for the number of representatives for each state to be based on the population of the state, giving some states an advantage. The convention lasted 4 months, over the course of which the delegates hammered out a bundle of compromises, including the Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise. It blended the Virginia and New Jersey plan to have a bicameral legislature and the Constitution. This bicameral legislature included a lower house, the House of Representatives, elected by the people, and in the upper house, the Senate, elected by state legislatures, where also the Senate was, of course, every state gets 2. The president and vice president were to be elected by electoral college, not the citizens themselves, because the framers didn't trust the general voting of regular people. They didn't think that they weren't smart enough to vote for a good president. The Constitution also laid out a method for counting slaves among the populations of southern states for proportional representation in Congress, even though those slaves would not be citizens. This became known as the 3/5 Compromise because each slave counted as 3/5 of a person. It also established 3-branch government, executive, legislative, and judicial, with the power of checks and balances on each other. Only 3 of the 42 delegates who remained in Philadelphia to the end refused to sign the finished document. I know one of them was Patrick Henry. 2, because it did not include a Bill of Rights, which is the reason why he didn't sign. We'll stop video 1 there.